So welcome, good evening and welcome. My name is Melissa Karen. I'm the director of the Ethics Center, Mudd Center for Ethics, and I'm very happy to be here welcoming you to our third lecture today in this series of How We Live and Die. Excuse me. So today we have our speaker, Carl Elliott, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Minnesota. His training poises him incredibly well to be here talking to us about bioethics. He first trained as a medical physician at the Medical University of South Carolina. Is that the right name? So he actually has his MD. And I remember trying to sort of wrap my head around that he has both his MD, and then after he got his MD, he then tacked a different course. He decided not to go into the world of medicine as a physician. He decided to get his doctorate in philosophy, which is what he did at Glasgow University in Scotland. And so that combination, that bifocal awareness he had of both medicine and philosophy, has allowed him to really think through, from a position of bioethics, the apparatus of American medicine and its very complicated and convoluted elements around medical research and the commercialization around medicine. And I came to his work actually more recently, but I will say that he has a very impressive CV of publications, 5 monographs, 3 edited volumes, not to say anything about the scores of essays that he's written, both for academic or in academic pieces, but also editorials and opinion pieces. And that's actually how I came to know his work first. His perspective, and it was a piece that he wrote that is in relation to his most recent publication. This was the editorial, In Medicine, the Morally Unthinkable Too Easily Comes to Seem Normal. So that title really encapsulates the thrust of what he was doing in this essay, which was in many ways a preview to then this new book of his. This is his 5th monograph, The Occasional Human Sacrifice, Medical Experimentation and the Price of Saying No. I'll say that when I've read both of these, I realized how important his voice and his perspective were to this series on medical ethics. That can sometimes, if you're not looking carefully and closely enough, can almost make you feel as though there are guardrails in place and regulatory bodies in place to protect us. And I think what I came away with and realized how important it was to have Dr. Elliott's voice is his perspective and his story on stories and the stories he represents and shares with us about the places where there have been failings in medicine and how that has hurt human beings. So without further ado, I think I'll stop there and hope that that introduces him and his work enough and his training. And so please help me welcome Dr. Carl Elliott.
You're going to help me get mine up?
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's it.
Okay, good. So there's a lot of stuff here. I'm afraid I'm going to break something. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for coming out. I've always wanted to come to Washington, Lee, actually, because of the famous honor code here, which I have a particular interest in for reasons that'll start to become evident as I talk more about my book, which is here. So despite the title of the book, which was not actually my first choice, this is a book about whistleblowers. It's a book about people who expose the crimes and the sins of their own group, right, their own organization. And I think there's a sense out there that we know how whistleblower stories generally go because we see so many whistleblower stories in books and movies and newspaper articles. And they're what Kurt Vonnegut used to call man-in-a-hole stories, right? Somebody gets into trouble and then they get out again. Kurt Vonnegut used to plot this out on a graph. So the line goes straight, then takes a dip, then it returns to the baseline. People love this story. People never get tired of this story. And the reason they never get tired of it is because of the reassuring message of this story. Job survives his ordeals and is rewarded by God for his faithfulness. Dorothy defeats the wicked witch and finds her way back to Kansas. The whistleblower exposes the truth and brings down the corrupt organization. So the man gets out of the hole. But I've come to realize there's something missing in this account, and what's missing is what it's like to be in the hole. Because when you're in the hole, your thoughts tend to turn inward, right? The world outside the hole fades away. Because when you're down in the hole, all you can think about is what it's like to be in the hole and how you're going to get out of the hole. You might not even be sure that it's a hole that you're in. It could be a cave. It could be the trunk of a car. It could be a coffin. It could be a dungeon. It could be a cell. It could be the crawl space under John Wayne Gacy's porch steps. All you know is that you're flailing around in the dark. So the book is framed by my own experience at the University of Minnesota, where I spent the better part of 7 years trying to get an external investigation of the suicide of a young man named Dan Markingson in a research study conducted by our Department of Psychiatry. So this is a picture of Dan and his mother, Mary Weiss. So basically the story here is that Dan was psychotic, he was delusional, and he was under a civil commitment order in 2003 when he was recruited from a locked unit at our teaching hospital at Fairview. It was a study of antipsychotic drugs, and he was recruited into the study over the objections of his mother, who was his only family member. She didn't want him in the study, right? He was incompetent to consent. He was floridly psychotic. He was delusional. He was threatening to kill people, including her. And he was under a stay of commitment that directed him to obey the recommendations of the psychiatrist who was trying to recruit him into the study. She objected, but she was told, look, he's an adult. He signed the consent form. He's in the study, right? So he's signed up into the study and sent to a halfway house. Mary Weiss spent the next 4 months trying to get him out of this study. She called, she emailed, she went to the department, she wrote letters to the department chair, warning again and again, he's getting worse, right? In April of 2004, she sent a letter, she left a voice message for the study coordinator saying, does he have to kill himself or somebody else before somebody does something? 3 weeks after that voice message, Dan nearly decapitated himself with a box cutter in the bathroom of that halfway house. And his body was found along with a note that said, I went through this experience smiling. So I spent over 6 years digging into that story and trying to get an external investigation of it, and wrote about it for Mother Jones magazine in 2010. After which I spent another 5 years filing complaints to regulatory bodies, writing editorials, lobbying politicians, organizing protests and events on campus, petitions, vigils, all of it with zero success. I mean, nothing. This did not make me a terribly popular figure in the medical school, or in the bioethics center, I should say. But finally, with the help of Arne Carlson, former governor of Minnesota, we managed to get an investigation by the Office of the Legislative Auditor, which is a state watchdog agency in Minnesota. And when it came back in March of 2015, it felt like a vindication. Found coercion, conflicts of interest, everything that I think most reasonable people could have seen from the very beginning. And if this had been a movie, this would have been when the credits started to roll, right? This would have been the happy ending. But here's the thing. Turns out vindication isn't really the same thing as getting out of the hole. It's kind of more like crawling out of a ditch in the middle of the desert. I would say, if anything, being vindicated made my colleagues in the medical school hate and despise me even more. And to be honest, it didn't really change anything. There was no official apology. There was no compensation for Mary Weiss. There were no sanctions for the researchers at fault. And there was no real reform. And so today, 9+ years later, the whole episode has been almost completely forgotten at the University of Minnesota, and I would say in the state of Minnesota. So a few years ago, I think mainly as a way of trying to figure out how things might have gone better, I started teaching a class at the University of Minnesota for undergraduates on medical research scandals. A deeply demoralizing class. All scandals, only scandals, 2 a week for a term. We start with the classics, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, the Willowbrook Hepatitis Study, and then we move on to more current abuses like the fraudulent, lethal synthetic trachea implants by Paolo Macchiarini in Sweden, and the recent forced ketamine trials in Minneapolis. So basically the idea behind this was I wanted to put a whole lot of scandals side by side and look at them to see if I could figure out what sort of patterns emerged, right? What I was really trying to figure out is the University of Minnesota a uniquely terrible institution, or are other institutions similarly terrible? And what I found out was that my experience was actually pretty typical. Research institutions never do the right thing. They deny wrongdoing, they stonewall the press, they protect their own faculty members, they rarely apologize, and basically do whatever they can to avoid compensating the victims or their families. And the whistleblowers are ostracized, fired, sued, and at least in one case reported to the police. It also turns out, I found, that whistleblowers are pretty rare. So in most cases that we look at, we found that doctors, nurses, administrators all know that patients are being harmed, lied to, exploited, often for years, but they don't say anything at all about it, right? They just stay quiet. And so I started to wonder about the people who did step out of line and speak out. What was different about them? How do they explain why they did what they did? What about the people who didn't say anything, right? How do they explain it? So let me just start with the second question, which is the question of why don't bystanders to abuse speak out and try to stop the abuse? You might think that's an easy question to answer. You would go to them and ask them and record their answers, right? And so academics have actually done this, right? They've gone into organizations where bad things have happened, and they ask the people who said nothing, why didn't you say anything? And the bystanders will generally say some combination of 3 things. 1, I was afraid of retaliation, I would be punished. 2, wouldn't have done any good. Blowing the whistle would have been futile. And 3, I don't rat out my own group. I'm not a snitch. That's what they say. That's presumably what they tell themselves. The question is, are they being honest with themselves and with the people who are asking the questions? So I want to show you, before I get into the meat of the book, a very interesting empirical study. This was a psychology experiment about whistleblowing done in the Netherlands, in 2012, right? Published in Social Influence, and it was modeled on the famous Stanley Milgram obedience studies, which you probably know about. Most of us learn about these in high school or college, right? So these are the famous studies where 65% of the subjects obeyed the orders of a man in a white coat to give what they thought could be lethal electrical shocks to another person. That's the classic study. In this new version of the study, the researchers wanted to find out whether a group of university students would blow the whistle on a study that was obviously dangerous, right? So here's what they did. They got all the students in a room, maybe a room like this, I'm thinking, and they told them that they were looking for help recruiting subjects for a study that they were doing. And they arranged for them to be approached by a formally dressed scientist who's really just a kind of actor wearing a white coat. I'm imagining somebody like this, right? So the fake scientist comes in and he tells them about the study. He says, what we're doing is a sensory deprivation experiment. It says basically what we do is we take our subjects and we lock them in this isolation chamber where they can't see anything and they can't hear anything, and then we keep them there and we measure their brain activity to see what happens, right? He says we had a little, did a pilot study, small group of research subjects. Did not go all that well. They started to hallucinate and their thoughts became disordered, and they wanted out of the pod, obviously, but we couldn't let them out because that would have ruined the study. So we're going to try it again. And what we would like for you to do is help us get subjects for this study. He said, what we need from you is to recruit your acquaintances and friends, recommend this study to them in a text or an email using at least 2 of these words: exciting, incredible, great, or superb. So the study is designed to make it as easy as possible for subjects to refuse and blow the whistle, right? So they give them plenty of time, no rush to do this. The fake scientist, the actor in a white coat, he leaves the room so that there's no confrontation with some sort of authority figure. And they're also told, look, the university's ethics committee is still looking at this study. They're looking for feedback, so we're going to leave you a form. If you have any ethical worries about this, any objections at all, leave them on the form. It'll be totally anonymous, and we will make sure that it's delivered to the ethics committee, and so they'll know about that. There's not going to be any way to trace it back to you. So before I tell you the results of the study, there was a kind of ingenious twist, which is really the interesting piece of it. There were actually 2 groups, or 2 kinds of groups, right? One kind of group was presented with the scenario purely in theory, right, as a hypothetical, kind of like I'm presenting it to you. If you were asked to present this study to your friends and recruit them into it, would you do it? And in that case, virtually nobody could imagine themselves cooperating with that study. So 96% said that they would either refuse or blow the whistle or both, right? That was in theory. In practice, it was just the opposite. When the subjects were actually put in that situation, where they actually got that pitch from the fake scientist, over 3/4 complied. So 77% sent out those emails to their friends using those words exciting, incredible, superb, and so on. How many blew the whistle to the ethics committee? 9%. So 96% said they would, only 9% actually did. Now the reason why I give you this study is, remember what bystanders say when they're asked, why didn't you blow the whistle? I was afraid of retribution, it would have been futile, and I don't rat out my own group. Well, in this case, none of those applied, right? And they still didn't blow the whistle. So something else is going on here. And we can talk about that later. Now that's the bystanders. What the book is really about is not the bystanders, it's about the whistleblowers. So what I wanted to do was talk to whistleblowers, track them down, have conversations with them, try to understand why they felt compelled to do what they did, whether they were successful, and what happened to them. And so here are the cases that I picked. Some of you may have seen that Peter Buxton, the whistleblower in Tuskegee, died this past spring. I would like to be able to report back to you that these whistleblower stories have happy endings, but that would not be the case. They don't. It is a rare whistleblower who doesn't have a lot of ambivalence and mixed feelings about their experience. And a lot of them come away deeply scarred. And they come away deeply scarred even when the whistleblowing succeeds. Those scars mark them for the rest of their lives. Even if they're not fired, even if they're not financially ruined, even if they win, because the world doesn't look the same to them anymore. So why do they do it? And again, when I first started talking to whistleblowers, I had thought that there would be a simple way to find out why they blew the whistle, which would be just to ask them, so why did you blow the whistle? But it turns out when you ask that question, the answers you get are not really that straightforward. In other words, they don't really give you a moral argument, right? They don't appeal to foundational principles. They don't cite legal statutes. They don't quote the Bible. They don't talk about the Hippocratic Oath. Instead, they say things like, well, if I didn't speak out, what would I say to my children? Or, how could I keep quiet and look at myself in the mirror? So they answer the question with these sort of non-answers. So let me give you an example, not from my book, although I do talk about it. And so, like a lot of my examples, this leads back to Richard Nixon, the dark figure that haunted my childhood. My kids have Voldemort, I had Nixon. I'm looking around, there are very few of you old enough to remember the Senate Watergate hearings in the summer of 1973, but I do. And if you are old enough, there is a moment that's seared into your brain, and it's this one. It's the moment when Alexander Butterfield, White House aide, told the Senate Watergate Committee that Nixon had installed a secret taping system in the White House. So this is the pivotal moment in Nixon's downfall, right? This is the moment where the hard evidence of his crimes can't be hidden anymore. I'm not so interested in what Butterfield did, though. What I want to point out is how he explained it. So when he was asked later why he did it, he just said, well, I answered truthfully because I'm a truthful person. In other words, I did it because that's the kind of person I am. Now, I should say, I'm not the first person to notice these kinds of non-explanations that whistleblowers give. One of my favorite books on whistleblowing is by the political scientist Fred Alford, who spent years interviewing whistleblowers and who admires them. But he's also struck by the way that whistleblowers tend to turn a moral question about the well-being of others into a question about themselves, right? He says, look, even if they're acting out of principle, even if they have a lot of empathy for the victims, that's not what they talk about. Instead, they talk about themselves. They talk about facing their kids. They talk about looking in the mirror. And he calls this narcissism moralized. He says whistleblowers are obsessed with their own moral purity. And so if they find themselves in an organization that is corrupt or cruel or unjust, they rebel. So they push back against the assumption that they're like everybody else. It's a terrific book. I recommend it, but I think he's wrong about this. When I talk to whistleblowers, I don't hear narcissism. What I hear is the ethic of honor and shame. Yes, it is true that whistleblowers talk about themselves. That's what honor and shame are all about, right? They're about maintaining your self-respect by holding yourself accountable for your moral failures. That's the distinguishing feature of honor. It's about your obligations to yourself. So of course whistleblowers talk about themselves. It's perfectly natural. The ethic of honor is fundamentally about respect and self-respect, right? That's what people mean when they say things like, how could I hold my head up? What they're getting at is, how could I respect myself? Because honor is not just about getting respect from others, although that's very important. That's why insults require a response in the honor ethic, and why violence is so common in the honor ethic. But the honor ethic is also about deserving respect. You want to be the kind of person who is worthy of the respect you get. And if you fail, you feel ashamed, right? That's not wounded narcissism. That's just what happens when an honorable person fails to measure up to the honor code. So let me give you some examples. This is Ron Jones, who's one of the three whistleblowers, the three doctors at National Women's Hospital in New Zealand, in Auckland. This was a study where women with a precursor of cervical cancer were left untreated, often for years or even decades. And so when I asked Ron, what tipped the balance for you? He said, well, I guess it's a reflection of the nature of the man I am. This is Oscar Simonson, cardiovascular surgeon at the Karolinska Institute, who helped expose the crimes of his colleague Paolo Macchiarini. When I asked him, he said, well, because I have to be able to hold my head up. This is John Pasando at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center in Seattle, who helped expose the deaths that resulted from an experimental bone marrow transplant in the 1980s and 90s. John told me, you know, I'd like to think I've never hurt another person in this life, at least not deliberately, and that's just who I am. To me, these people sound a lot like Alexander Butterfield. I did it because I'm the kind of person who does that. That's the language of honor. Now, whenever I mention the word honor, I feel as if I need to step back and explain a little bit, maybe not in this audience, but to some, because it does feel so much like a word from another era and not always a good one. A lot of people, when they hear it, they think honor killings, the military, maybe The Godfather, right? Because there is this serious downside to the honor ethic, and the downside is violence. I'm not interested in endorsing the content of the honor ethic. My job is interpretive, right? Sometimes when I talk about this, people will say, you know, all this talk about honor makes me really uncomfortable. Couldn't you talk about professional ethics instead? Which I would gladly do if anybody ever mentioned professional ethics to me when I talk to them, but they don't. What they tell me is the sort of thing that I've told you about holding their heads up, about being true to who they are. If it makes you feel any better, just substitute the word integrity for honor. It's very similar. The reason I use honor is because in the honor ethic, it's important not just to do the right thing, but to be seen to be doing the right thing. And this seems to be a key part of the whistleblower struggle. how do you maintain your self-respect when you've lost the respect of your community? Now, as I was saying earlier, one of the troubling things I found in talking to whistleblowers is that they're haunted by their experience, even when it looks from the outside as if they have been very successful. And it's not just because they were threatened or fired or formally punished, although a lot of them were. There seems to be something deeper going on. Sometimes when I was talking to them, I got the sense as if their lives had been divided into two parts. There was the part before they blow the whistle and the part after they blew the whistle. So there's this kind of very profound existential break. Now, part of this, I think, has something to do with what whistleblowers tend to be like. I think it's fair to say that blowing the whistle takes a certain amount of idealism. There's a reason cynics don't blow the whistle. They're convinced that the system is rigged and the only result is that it's going to blow back on them, right? To blow the whistle, you need to have at least some minimal expectation that when you do it, other people are going to be as outraged as you are, right? If you speak out about something that's obviously cruel or corrupt or unfair, other people will see it like you do. And it turns out this almost never happens. You think the authorities are going to leap into action, and they don't. You think your colleagues are going to stand by you, and they don't. You think you're doing the right thing, but the world treats you like you're Judas Iscariot. And so you come away really shaken and kind of disoriented because your whole view of the way the world works has been upended. And that drives a lot of people to a really dark place. So I want to tell you about a conversation that I had that just really sticks with me. It was with a cardiovascular surgeon named Matthias Corbaccio. He actually grew up in America, grew up in California. But he is one of the whistleblowers who exposed the crimes of Paolo Macchiarini in Sweden. And when I was talking to him, he told me a story from his time in high school in California where police found cocaine in the car of a friend of his. And the friend told everybody that the cocaine belonged to Matthias. He says, you know, look, I was 17 years old. I'd never done cocaine in my life. And that feeling of being wrongly accused stuck with him. He said, blowing the whistle felt like that. It's not just that the real offenders get off, it's that you are seen with such contempt, right? All your illusions that there's some kind of justice in the world get shattered. So I think that's a big part of it, this existential disillusionment. But I think another part has to do with identity. Because if you're a doctor in an academic medical center, when you blow the whistle, you become radioactive. Nobody wants to be around you. Even people who could be secretly sympathetic are afraid to say so because they're afraid they'll become radioactive too. The radioactivity can infect other people. And so what this means is that the whistleblower is cut off from the very community that has given them their sense of professional identity and self-respect. They're cast out, right? And they're cast out precisely because they've done what they think honor demands that they do. Now, it turns out this is especially important in medical research because the oversight of medical research is literally an honor system. It was set up that way intentionally. Research is not formally regulated like a business is. So there's nobody from the government standing over the investigator's shoulder and making sure that they do the right thing. There are no health and safety inspectors like you would get if you were running a restaurant or that there would be in a factory. We simply trust medical researchers to be honest. We trust them to play by the rules and actually do what they say they're doing. So it's like an honor code. But, as you know, any honor code depends on bystanders to speak out when they see abuses. It demands that people speak out when they see somebody cheating on a test, right? And in medical research, that rarely happens. So this is an important piece of the puzzle, this sense of honor or personal integrity that a lot of whistleblowers seem to feel. But there's something else. I don't know if you've ever seen Ibsen's play. It's a sort of the archetypal whistleblower story, Enemy of the People. It's about this whistleblower doctor named Thomas Stockton who discovers that the water in town is contaminated, and so he tries to warn the town. But nobody believes him. And they all turn on him. Even his own family, some parts of his own family turn on him. And the play ends with him standing with his finger in the air saying, the strongest man in the world is the one who stands most alone. Well, in reality, not exactly. Truth is pretty much exactly the opposite of that. Standing alone is a recipe for self-immolation. When you start to look at medical whistleblowers who have had some measure of success and survived the ordeal psychologically to tell about it, what you'll often find is that there wasn't a single whistleblower standing alone. There was a group of them standing together. So in Auckland, there were 3, Ron Jones along with Bill McIndoe and Jock McLean. With the Macchiarini scandal in Sweden, there were 4 whistleblowers, 3 surgeons and a critical care doctor. In Cincinnati, Martha Stevens, the whistleblower, was working with her junior faculty association. In Willowbrook, the whistleblower was Mike Wilkins, but he was working with a whole collective of activist doctors living together under one roof. So it turns out that solidarity is critically important for psychological survival. But it's not the only reason it's critical. So let me go back to that original Stanley Milgram study, right? It's very bleak, but what people often don't realize about the Milgram study is that he did follow-up studies. And if you look at the follow-up studies, you'll see that they pointed toward a solution. So what Milgram found was that he could tip the scales away from obedience and towards the demands of conscience by manipulating the conditions of the study. And the biggest condition that he could change was by putting dissenting Confederates in the room, right? So if the fake scientist is accompanied by another fake scientist who comes in and says, I don't know, Jim, we may be going too far, I'm not sure, maybe we should cut this off, none of the research subjects in the study would go ahead after that. And if they put fake research studies in, research subjects in who refused to shock, then it became extremely unlikely that the people who were being tested in that way were willing to give what they thought were shocks as well, right? So in other words, the people in the study were far more likely to follow their conscience if they didn't feel so isolated and alone in their dissent. So the key to dissent is solidarity. That might sound uplifting, and I always like to end my talks on a really demoralizing note. So what I've got to do now is tell you the most demoralizing thing that I learned from my research scandals course. So I talked about bystanders, I talked about whistleblowers, but another thing I started to wonder about was, what about the researchers responsible for abuses, right? What happens to them? So I got another story to tell you there. This story takes place in June of 2017. I'd gone to Cincinnati to meet this woman, Martha Stevens, who was the whistleblowing English professor who exposed the Cincinnati radiation studies way back in 1972. So these were Pentagon-funded studies during the Vietnam War designed to figure out how radiation would affect American soldiers in case of a nuclear attack. And so to do that, a radiologist named Eugene Sanger was subjecting poor cancer patients, about 60% of them black, to total body irradiation without telling them why, without telling them it was for the military, and without telling them it might kill them, which it did in a number of cases. So I had read that the University of Cincinnati had been forced to put up a memorial to the victims of the radiation studies by a judge. And I never heard of a hospital doing such a thing, voluntarily or under duress. And so I decided I needed to see it. So I flew to Cincinnati and went to the hospital. When I got to the hospital, I couldn't find it. I wandered around everywhere. And when I started to ask around, what I found was that nobody I talked to knew anything about it. They'd never heard of the memorial. They'd never even heard of the studies. But finally, I'm guessing it probably took 45 minutes or so, after calling around all over the hospital, somebody located a young woman from the radioisotope lab who knew what I was talking about. And this woman came up and met me, took me down into the sub-basement, led me through this long series of very dark, twisting tunnels, took me to a stairwell, and we came up into the light, and we're standing in this, what looks like a kind of empty courtyard, next to a parking ramp and a bunch of heating equipment. It kind of looked like the place where hospital employees might sneak out for a cigarette. But I couldn't see a memorial. So I say, where is it? And she says, oh, it's over there. And this is what she was pointing at. And I'm like, that looks like shrubbery to me. And she goes, oh yeah, well, I guess it is a little hard to see. The memorial's behind the shrubbery, I guess. So you could, what you need to do is sort of slide in there and put your back against the wall and look out toward the shrubbery, and then you can see it. And so that's what I did. And when I went back there you could see it. Kind of small, about 2 feet by 2 feet, and has a list of names and initials in the header, In Memoriam Radiation Effects Study, 1960 to 72. And for some reason, it faced the wall of the hospital, right? So you had to kind of stand there like this and look at it. So I took this picture. I took a few pictures to show to Martha Stevens, wondering if she had seen it recently. And the woman with me said, would you like to see the Sanger lab? And I said, Sanger lab as in Eugene Sanger? And what I'm thinking is the man behind the atrocities, but I didn't say that to her. She said, yeah, the Sanger lab. I was like, wow, there's a lab named for Eugene Sanger. So she took me up to see it. And there in the waiting room is this sort of little shrine to Eugene Sanger with photos and awards and old medical equipment and so on. And I thought to myself, this is the way these things work, right? To the doctor behind the atrocities, a shrine. To the victims, a plaque hidden in the shrubbery. And if you look at other studies, it turns out you'll find something very similar. So take, for example, John Cutler. Cutler's the man, one of the few most famously implicated in 2 great research scandals. He was involved in the Tuskegee Syphilis Studies and then also the Guatemala Syphilis Studies, which President Obama apologized for in 2011. So this is the man who, according to a report by a Presidential Bioethics Commission, dripped gonorrheal pus into the eyes of a dying mentally ill woman in Guatemala to see if her eyes would become infected. They did. So what happened to him? Well, he was made a dean and had a named lectureship in his honor at the University of Pittsburgh. This is Saul Krugman. He's the NYU pediatrician who gave hepatitis A and hepatitis B to institutionalized mentally disabled children at the Willowbrook School in Staten Island. What happened to him immediately after he was exposed? His colleagues elected him president of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Albert Kligman, this is the University of Pennsylvania dermatologist who famously said that when he first went into Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia, what he saw was, quote, acres of skin, like a farmer gazing on a fertile field. Among his many barbaric experiments was one where he took $10,000 from Dow Chemicals to expose prisoners to the active ingredient in Agent Orange. What happened to him? Accolades, awards, honorary degrees, and the presidency of his specialty organization. Chester Southam, the man who injected live cancer cells into elderly patients at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in Brooklyn. What happened to him? His colleagues elected him president of the American Association for Cancer Research. Eugene Sanger himself, the man with the shrine in Cincinnati. After he was exposed, his radiology colleagues gave him their subspecialty's highest honor. Robert Heath, the psychiatrist at Tulane who worked with the CIA, who accidentally killed 2 of his mentally ill subjects by giving them brain abscesses, and then famously tried to use deep brain stimulation to turn a gay patient straight. What was his punishment? I think you're seeing a pattern here. You might be thinking, well, look, this is all in distant past. Some of these honors are being reconsidered now, which is true, at least in the case of Cutler and Kligman. But you would be wrong to think that this doesn't happen now, right? During the long 8 years that the Dan Markingson scandal was in the public eye, our chair of psychiatry kept collecting honors and awards. And finally, in case you are still hanging on to the hope that the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, have a look at the bone marrow transplant scandal at the Fred Hutch Cancer Center, where at least 21 people died. The whistleblower in that case, John Pasando, lost his job and never worked in cancer research again. He spent the rest of his life reviewing disability claims for the federal government. What about the co-investigator on that study, Donald Thomas? In 1990, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine. So let me just finish by turning back to the question that I started with, which is, what does this mean for the whistleblowers, right? Because it turns out every whistleblower needs to make some kind of sense of what's happened to them. Everybody has to tell themselves a story to make it meaningful, right? And when it ends like that, with no justice at all, it's hard to come up with a whistleblower story that is not terribly sad and demoralizing. It's a man in the hole story where the man never gets out of the hole. Because if you measure the value of your actions by what you achieved, then the story that you're going to tell yourself is that you were a chump. You were the dumb money at the table. Everybody else knew that the system was rigged. Everybody else knew that speaking out was going to do nothing. And so they all kept quiet. Only you were naive enough to throw away your career for nothing. And that's a very hard story to live with. Now, I do think that there are alternative stories to tell. Some of them I told in the book. I think it helps if you can tell yourself a story about honor, for example. Because what honor requires is not that you succeed, but that you are able to respect yourself when it's over. For other people, I think it helps if they can think of their story as part of a bigger struggle, right? For civil rights, for example, or disability rights, or women's rights, a struggle in which a verdict is going to be rendered by history, not by immediate success. And maybe there are other stories to tell. I don't know. These are just two of the kinds of stories that I heard. Every person is different, every situation is different, but I think the existential challenge that most whistleblowers share is coming up with some kind of story that they can live with, and hopefully one that gets them out of the hole. So thank you. I'll end there. I always... I was going to say it always feels weird to end with such a demoralizing story, and people are expected to applaud for something so horrible. So I feel for you.
So we have time for some questions. If anybody has so you go right ahead.
Yeah, you got 3 right there. Let's go left to right. Yeah. So you, yeah.
I was just going to ask, in the beginning you mentioned that the occasional human sacrifice wasn't your first choice for your title, and I was just wondering about that.
Well, I wanted something that highlighted the whistleblowers' struggle. And so I actually had a Guggenheim Fellowship to work on this. And the project for that was called Lonesome Whistle. There's an old Hank Williams song called Lonesome Whistle that you may know if you know anything about country music or blues music. So that was it, but the publishers hated that. They thought it sounded like a spaghetti western, which I was fine with. I'm like, spaghetti westerns are great. But, yeah. Anyway, yeah. Okay, thanks for that reminder.
So I really appreciate, I guess, your point that you're making about the stories that whistleblowers tell themselves. I'm curious, when thinking about the researchers in these cases that are committing all these atrocities, what kinds of stories do you think they're telling themselves in order to justify a lot of these experiments?
Okay, so the question is, what sort of stories do the researchers behind the atrocities tell themselves? Honestly, I don't know. I suspect it's some kind of story of medical success done for humanitarian reasons in which they're being persecuted unjustly. I do have, so I didn't get a chance to talk to many of the researchers behind these atrocities firsthand, because most of them are not alive anymore. But the University of Cincinnati does have an oral history project. They still celebrate Eugene Sanger, so he's one of their most famous, celebrated figures. And so they have an oral history project that you can go to online and listen to him be interviewed. And when he's asked about this, the questions that he gets and the answers that he gives are, basically there were a bunch of left-wing nuclear disarmament people who made false accusations against me and tried to bring me down, but I survived and conquered them. That was his story. I don't know how widely that would be shared, but that would be a good book to work on. You work on that book.
So I was wondering, are there any distinct identifiable psychological patterns that you found in whistleblowers that could be harnessed by potential employers or people that are choosing researchers that could be used by corrupt organizations to avoid the risk of being exposed?
Okay, so then the question is, are there any psychological characteristics that whistleblowers share? There have been a lot of people who have wondered if that's the case and who have tried to study it. And in fact, one of the things that the researchers in that study that I gave you about the fake scientist and so on, one of the things they did was give every student a psychological profile, test them psychologically to figure out if they could find any difference between that very small number who spoke out and the ones who didn't. And they couldn't. There was no difference. And that's generally what others have found as well. There doesn't seem to be any kind of predictor there. I suspect that they're looking in the wrong place, and that where they should be looking is in circumstances that make it possible, make it easier for people to speak out rather than any psychological characteristic of the whistleblowers themselves. Now, that said, you know, I had a very small sample size. I wouldn't claim that this is generalizable in any way, and I can think of other ways in which the generalization may turn out to be an artifact. But I will say that the whistleblowers that I talked to were, in general, an amazingly tenacious, maybe even stubborn bunch of people, right? I mean, it was very striking that they stuck with this battle for so long and just refused to give up. Now, the reason I say it might have been an artifact is that the whistleblowers that I found and were able to speak out are in cases in which there was at least the measure. I wouldn't say that they all succeeded and some failed spectacularly, but they were at least able to expose it, right, so that I knew about it. There could be way more whistleblowers out there who gave up a lot earlier and that I know nothing about. So that's what I mean by it could be an artifact of the particular group of people that I talked to. But it is kind of striking, that particular characteristic. Hey, yeah.
You talked about narcissism moralized in your presentation. I wanted to know where you draw the line between that and honor ethics that you also discussed.
So the question is, what's the difference? Is there a line between the honor ethic and narcissism moralized? Well, I think one big difference is that the honor ethic is a way of explaining systems of morality that's deeply rooted in many cultures and then is studied by anthropologists and sociologists and historians, not to mention philosophers recently. And narcissism moralized is a term that Fred Alford made up. What he was trying to explain was why do these people talk about themselves? Why is the first thing that people think about their own conscience rather than the well-being of others? Which is, you know, they're obviously concerned about the well-being of others, but why isn't what they talk about? I think there's an obvious interpretive explanation, and it's the one that I gave, right? You don't have to make up something new. That said, I think that what he's talking about is a genuine part of the honor ethic, and it doesn't have anything to do with narcissism. It's the purity part of it, because I think there is this sense embedded in the honor ethic that, that people who are blowing the whistle on an organization very often identify with it, and they feel ashamed of the organization itself. They feel as if the entire medical profession is being stained by the actions of these people, and something needs to be done about it. And part of the reason they feel it deeply is that they feel the stain themselves because they're part of it, right? Again, though, I think Fred would probably disagree with me, but I'm right. Yes?
So you mentioned in a lot of these cases that the offending research groups never offered up an apology. I'm kind of wondering what the significance of that is, like what is the apology actually doing? Because I'm wondering if it's just about acknowledging accountability, then the fact these apologies likely aren't genuine might undermine some of that.
So the question here is about the power of an apology and why people don't apologize. Well, I mean, so one thing I found, this wasn't necessarily a part of the book, but in other parts of my professional life, what I found is that more than anything else, what the victims of these scandals want, of these abuses want, is an apology. Like, I'm not in it for the money, I just want someone to apologize. there's something incredibly powerful about that. And in some ways, it's an exchange of honor, right? What an apology requires, I mean, people who have been wronged by medical researchers often feel a tremendous amount of guilt. They feel as if it's somehow their fault. They should have known, they should have been more careful, they should have been more distrustful, right? So there's often this sense of being harmed, but also a kind of humiliation for allowing it to happen, or allowing it to happen to their son or daughter or their mother or father or someone else. And what they want is some remedy for that, and an apology is a way of doing that. It requires the person with power to lower themselves in front of the person that they have wronged. That's what makes the apology so powerful. That said, a bad apology can make things much worse. An insincere apology personally, on a personal level, can make things worse than they were before, because it'll just make people feel even more humiliated. You think I'm buying this. But there are also public apologies by institutions that do a lot of work as well. Publicly, in terms of the way the world sees this abuse, but also to the victims, right? And that doesn't need to be sincere. It's often much more formal. It's often delivered by someone in a position of power rather than the person who's actually committed the wrongs. And both apologies do a different kind of work. But if your interest, as I think it should be, is to rectify the wrongs that have been done, I think apologies are enormously important. And they're often the one thing that institutions refuse to do. Institutions would rather pay out money than apologize. Eugene Sanger refused to apologize to the victims. The memorial was a kind of substitute, a second measure. If we can't make Eugene Sanger apologize, at least we can have this sort of formal institutional apology, which it turns out was kind of shrubbery. Right. I don't know, maybe let's go from the back.
So firstly, I just want to thank you for coming here and recounting your experiences with us. So my question, so I'm just going to wait.
That's fine.
So I had the opportunity to read your book, the chapter specifically on Martha Stevens and the whistleblowers in New Zealand, McIndoe, McLean, and Jones. And I saw the similarities that both of those shared, where it was hard to make progress and there was a lot of difficulties throughout and turmoil. But I also noticed that you recounted the vast differences between their experiences. Particularly Stevens, when she was trying to expose Sanger's studies and the things he committed, senators came to assist her. She also had faculty that she had worked with in exposing this. She had the assistance of her husband and journalists. And when you mentioned Jones's experience, they were less willing to bring it out to the press, kept it more to themselves, and like you said, you felt more ashamed of themselves for bringing this type of trouble to the institution. So I want to ask this. I know you said it's hard to generalize, and I respect that. I'm curious about your opinion regarding how societal differences and cultural differences may affect the route a whistleblower takes, or the likelihood of someone becoming a whistleblower, or if you think it's just temperamental factors.
Okay. I appreciate you contrasting those two, and I appreciate the question. I'm not sure how I can summarize it, though. How would I explain the differences? Well, so one thing I would say, let me just tell you a story, for example. I just got back from New Zealand, in August. And I was in Auckland talking about the book. And it turns out that in New Zealand, every year since the Cartwright report was the result of this judicial inquiry that the New Zealand government commissioned to look into the unfortunate experiment, which was about women with cervical cancer, a precursor of cervical cancer, being left untreated for decades. It turns out that in Auckland, there's a group of women who have gathered at National Women's Hospital every year since the Cartwright report was released in 1988, and have a ceremony on that day. It's very small, very modest, but they lay 2 wreaths of flowers. One is on a statue for the victims of the study, and they also have a small memorial there that they put up to the whistleblowers, McIndoe and McLean. Ron Jones is still alive, but he will be there, when he passes away. And they invited me to come to it. I found it enormously touching and moving that these women had continued to do this for decades, right? Some of the women there, I mean, there was 2 of the women there were Sandra Coney and Phillida Bunkle, the journalist who exposed it on the basis of what McIndoe, McLean, and Jones had given them, had published. But some of them were much younger, and yet they still all come together because they think it's important not to forget this, right? That's the kind of thing that is almost unthinkable in the United States, right? I've never seen it happen. I've never even thought of it as a possibility for it happening. And that, I think, I mean, just having lived in New Zealand for a fair bit of time over the years, this is totally a product of the way New Zealanders are. It's an extraordinary country. It's very small. It's very tightly connected. And it all feels very personal in a way that it rarely does in the United States. You asked about the difference between the whistleblowers there, Martha Stevens, and the whistleblowers there. Yeah, I mean, one of the things, so Ron Jones is really the only one left, so I can really just get his firsthand account. But he feels like when I asked him, why did it take you so long to go to the press? His thing is like, that was unthinkable, right? It never occurred to us that this was a possibility, like a moral possibility. It was just not done. And it turns out that he thinks in retrospect it was a mistake, but he felt as if it was just something that they could not do. Another part of it was that, unlike Martha, they were working in National Women's Hospital, and they were very proud of it. I think part of the guilt that Ron feels is that he essentially destroyed this institution. He ruined the reputation of it, and he was enormously proud of it. It was like a jewel in the New Zealand medical system. They did enormously important work there. And as a result of the unfortunate experiment, it really never recovered. It didn't recover the trust of New Zealanders, and now it's completely shut down. I think he feels really bad about that. Martha Stevens, on the other hand, is in the English department. She didn't feel nearly the kind of identification with the things that were happening in the medical school. For her, it was much more like, lobbing bombs from a different part of campus. Plus, there was the anti-Vietnam War piece of it that was also part of her motivation. Yeah.
So, I'm so sorry. We've got so many other fantastic questions that I think we really, and let's just take a moment. For those who have to leave now, you can leave now, and then we'll just have like 2 more minutes for I see your question, yeah. All right, so you seem like you need to ask a question.
My question is, what advice would you give to someone who wants to go into research, or excited about going into research? Like, how do you cultivate or maintain your honorable story in the face of like widespread institutional corruption?
I mean, it's really hard. And honestly, I don't really have a lot of good advice other than the need for solidarity. I mean, there is something enormously difficult about being a novice in the medical system. If you go to medical school, you'll realize that as soon as you start seeing patients, you know nothing. And everybody else knows that you know nothing, and they will treat you like you know nothing, except when they need you to do something for them, and then they'll just assume that you know how to do it. And that's very difficult. But the difficulty is that when you are in that kind of environment, when you know nothing, it's like being in a foreign country. And you don't know what the manners are, what the ethics are. You don't want to offend people. You're just trying to figure out how to get along. And so you basically look around and do what everybody else is doing. And sometimes what everybody else is doing is something terrible. And it's not immediately obvious to you that it's terrible at the beginning because, you know, this is just what's going on here, right? It requires, I think, a kind of attention to yourself, because very often, not always, I mean, this is the difficulty, very often those little things that bother you right at the beginning, where you're kind of looking around and saying, you know, is this really how it's supposed to be done? I guess so. If you hang on to those things, that is like the seeds of resistance. But really what it takes is some way of connecting yourself with other people who feel those seeds of resistance as well. Because even if it's just one other person, that makes a huge difference. Like, it really makes all the difference. If you're not acting alone. One of the interesting things that happened as a result of writing this book is that one of the people who read it is a doctor who, it turns out, stopped a research disaster in the making in the early 1970s. It was a psychosurgery experiment in which neurosurgeons and psychiatrists were planning to operate on the brains of institutionalized, criminally insane people to make them less aggressive. It was not a lobotomy, it was an amygdalotomy, but it was irreversible and it was crazy. And he was just a resident at the time, and he thought it was crazy, but he didn't speak out about it. What he did was alert a reporter that he knew, and the press got a hold of it, and it was shut down because it was crazy. And as soon as the outside world knew about it, there was outrage. But he'd never told anybody about it. He said, you know, other than my wife, you're the first person I've ever told this to. I mean, you know, Lord, I mean, this is like 50 years ago, you know. And when I asked him, were you alone? He's like, no, actually there were two of us. You know, there's a psych resident who felt the same thing. He said, you know, if it had just been me, I would have never had the courage to do it. In a way, this is the way that you would want, this is the way you would want a whistleblower story to play out, right? He stopped it. He spared, you know, these poor research subjects, and he did it in a way in which satisfied his conscience and for which he wasn't punished, right? That's, you know, that's about as good as you can hope for in these cases. So maybe that's a very small thing, but you know, it turns out, you know, I think for those of us who've been in that situation, it turns out to be an enormously important thing.
I'm so sorry.
I am glad. Yeah, come talk to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There you go. Thank
Yeah.
you.
All right. Thank you.